Hello, everybody. It's a very great pleasure tonight to welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales, Susan Park, Professor of Global Governance at the University of Sydney. Professor Park's topic could hardly be more relevant following 24 hours in which Australia's climate change policies have taken what might or might not be a giant leap forward. Her topic is, can international agreements prevent climate change catastrophe? It's an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of multilateral environmental agreements and their possible use as a tool to prevent the catastrophe of which we've been warned for so many years, but which still looms. Professor Park will speak for half an hour, then we'll have half an hour for questions and discussion. Please log your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time during her address or during the discussion that follows. But for now, it's over to Professor Park.
Thank you very much, Ian. So in 5 days, states will bring their most ambitious nationally determined commitments to the 26th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow. These NDCs aim to reduce states' greenhouse gas emissions in line with the 2015 Paris Agreement to keep global warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees limit above pre-industrial levels. So this really raises the question as to whether or not international environmental agreements like the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement can actually help us to avoid catastrophic climate change. And it's a very real question for those of us concerned with diplomacy as to how sovereign states come together to make these global commitments. So what I'm going to do over the next 30 minutes is to give you an idea of how this has emerged, to situate it within the context of broader multilateral environmental agreements. And then, of course, to talk about what some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Paris Agreement are in relation to what states need to do. Right, just to give you a bit of an idea, and hopefully you can see it on the screen in front of you. This is a table of all of the multilateral agreements signed between 1850 and 2016. As you can see, there are hundreds of multilateral environmental agreements that have been signed by states. To give you an idea, there's some very small numbers starting from 1850 all the way through to the Paris Agreement being signed in 2015. Multilateral environmental agreements are specifically a way for sovereign states to commit to address to international environmental problems. They are comprised of international legal instruments for states to be held accountable for. They comprise hard international law on the basis that states take their internationally agreed commitments home and ratify them into domestic law, thus making them binding. As you can see, the peak for new multilateral environmental agreements was the 1990s. Between 1990 well, that's the big peak, 1990 and 1994. So this coincided with the 1992 Earth Summit, where states agreed to commit to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They also, at the summit, agreed to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is currently struggling to address the 6th largest extinction. And soon after, in 1994, the UN Convention on Desertification. At Rio in 1992, they also agreed to non-binding commitments, the Rio Declaration, Agenda 21, and forestry principles. Forestry being one area where they were unable to reach agreement and still cannot reach an agreement to create a convention on deforestation. You'll note that there's been a significant dropping off of multilateral environmental agreements from that peak. Part of that reason is because states agree to conventions, such as the ones I've just mentioned, and from then agree to additional protocols and amendments. So you can see an increase in amendments from 2005 onwards. And this is a kind of recognition that states create a minimum level that they can get agreement on and then work towards ratcheting up that agreement. And that's where various amendments come in. So for example, the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer has now been amended 6 times to include all ozone depleting substances and all chemical companies. So it might also, alternatively, speak to an unwillingness on behalf of states to hold themselves to account for even more international environmental agreements, considering the difficulties they have with meeting the ones that they already have. If we look at the politics of climate change, we get a good sense of just how difficult that can be. Now, scientists have been aware of the fact that we might be changing the climate through emitting greenhouse gases. And they've known that since 1896. In 1957, Roger Reville, a scientist, reported to the US Senate that the Earth was like a spaceship. We'd better look out for its air control system, noting the difficulties and potentials for human-induced climate change. But it wasn't until 1979 that scientists were sufficiently concerned enough to gather for the first World Climate Conference. And this helped propel scientific concern, throughout the world, leading to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. And part of the reason why the IPCC is so important is because it was given 3 tasks. The first was to assess scientific information on climate change and to really gather all of the internationally peer-reviewed research being conducted about climate change, whether or not it was happening, how fast, and where. And obviously, this incorporates a whole range of different sciences. The second task it was given was to assess the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of climate change, to really identify what this means in terms of, well, what does sea level rise mean? What does it mean for glaciers to melt? What does it mean for there to be more extreme weather? So looking at how to assess the environmental and socioeconomic impacts. And then the third one is to formulate response strategies. So the IPCC comprised of scientists from all over the world, gathering all of this information and providing frequent reports as to the impact of climate change. The IPCC is the foremost authority on global climate change, and its very first report in 1990 confirmed the scientific basis for concern over climate change. But of course, creating an intergovernmental panel on climate change raised concerns as to how states would respond to the information that they were receiving. And it became very, very clear right from the get-go that there were divisions between countries on how to address climate change. From President Bush of the United States saying that the United States would not change its lifestyle, to developing countries' concerns as to how climate change would impact on its ability to develop, to small states concerned about whether or not they had the capacity to deal with climate change. Very, very real concerns and divisions, of course, between, for example, OECD countries that have the capacity and OPEC countries and other fossil fuel exporters. Very clear divisions over a whole range of issues. Nevertheless, in 1992, a framework convention was negotiated at Rio. And this was a sort of signal to the international community that this was a global problem that needed a global solution. And it was very open right from the beginning to have a convention that all states would be able to engage with. And so the UNFCCC detailed commitments that states could undertake in order to grapple with climate change. So I'm giving you quite a potted history because it gives us a better sense of how we ended up with the Paris Agreement and how we have come to this first review of states' nationally determined commitments. So the UNFCCC was really to look at what was going on. As with other international negotiations, a conference of the parties was established as the main decision-making forum. They also created additional bodies on scientific and technological advice and a body on implementation. And the UNFCCC was there to look at the national plans that states were creating in order to tackle climate change. As Jörg Wetterstad notes, the convention contained a loose call for a return to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the decade, either individually or jointly by the developed country parties, Annex 1, which are Annex 1 states. So we needed to know exactly what states were doing. So they asked for greenhouse gas inventories to be conducted. They looked to states to create national plans as to how they thought of responding to climate change. And of course, importantly for developing countries was an aim to have resource transfers in order for developing countries without the capacity to be able to tackle climate change. And as I said, this loose call to reduce greenhouse gases to 1990 levels. The new and additional resources were to be transferred to developing countries to enable them to meet their reporting requirements and to assist in their implementation. And the Framework Convention was underpinned by sovereign responses to climate change. But what was interesting, and it's pretty much mainly in the climate regime, but has expanded across to other international environmental agreements, was what would become a very strong norm of common but differentiated responsibility. And so the idea behind this norm was that everybody was affected by climate change. Everybody had a responsibility to it, but not everybody had the capacity to act on it. And so we have a very global agreement. There are now 197 signatories to the UNFCCC, a global agreement bound by this common shared concern around climate change and this common but differentiated responsibility norm that emerged alongside it. But of course, it's not, it wasn't plain sailing. And I think one of the strands here that I really want to make clear is that international environmental agreements are relatively slow moving. And of course, climate change is not. In 1994, the 50th state ratified the UNFCCC, bringing it into law, and the convention came into force. So as I said, there's now 197 members. And this led to the creation of the very first Conference of the Parties, which was held 1 year later. So the most global agreement means that these Conference of the Parties happen every year, and it's the primary vehicle through which states negotiate how they are going to respond to climate change and what they have done. At the very first COP held in Berlin, the main message was that there should be a more stringent protocol or legally binding instrument in order to set targets and timetables for developed countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the post-2000 period by 1997. And so the idea here was to move very, very fast, at least in diplomatic terms, to get concrete targets for states to adhere to. But states, of course, couldn't agree on which countries should be subject to these new commitments. And this almost led to a deadlock of the COP's decision-making procedures. And there had to be a brokering between different coalitions that didn't want to have such hard, firm targets and those that did. And we start to see the emergence of those leaders and laggards that are quite evident across a range of different issue areas, but are particularly pronounced in climate and global and international environmental agreements. Simply those that are champions of achieving meaningful change and those that are laggards that essentially don't want to block or drag targets down to the lowest common denominator. So we do see an attempt to create a binding target through the Kyoto Protocol. So you might be very familiar with this. It was highly ambitious in terms of going from a framework convention, very general in 1992, to 5 years later in Kyoto coming up with ambitious targets. Of course, completely divided over the timing of the targets, what sort of measures, which or all of the greenhouse gases should be included. And you see states shifting quite substantially through these negotiations. And so one of the complexities of climate politics is exactly how or what is the best means forward. And there's been remarkable growth over time in the research that is being done over the exact impact of all of the greenhouse gases. We talk about CO2 emissions the most because fossil fuels do have the sort of largest overall impact in terms of being burnt and emitting into the atmosphere. We talk about global warming potential and how we look at the various different gases, but also in terms of what states are willing to commit to and when and for how much. And so there's a great deal of bargaining that goes on in the climate regime of states identifying what they are capable of producing, by when and how much. And so what was brokered at Kyoto was that Annex 1 parties or developed states would agree to reduce their CO2 emissions by 5.2% during this window of 2008 to 2012, and to reduce it to 1990 levels. And of course, 1990 was in many cases an arbitrary point, but it was the one point that states could agree upon. And of course, this then led to states negotiating over or under that target. So 3 states were able to increase their emissions, Australia, Iceland, and Norway. We had Australia increasing its emissions by 8%, Iceland by 10%, and by Norway by 1% on the basis of their special needs, which really just speaks to their fossil fuel exports. We see states trying to stake a claim in going the other way, in showing just how willing they are to commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so just one of those themes throughout international environmental agreements is who are the leaders and who are the laggards. And the United States for Kyoto negotiated to reduce by 7% to 1990 levels. Europe committed to 8% and Japan by 6%. So this is really to give you a sense of what it was that states were willing to be held to account for. And of course, any requirement for developing countries to meet their targets were dropped by a veto of China and India. Even the possibility of opting into the Kyoto Protocol was blocked. And so this is a sort of quite typical, to be honest, in terms of the different factions within international environmental agreements. And China and India have quite often played this blocking role, not necessarily because they're anti, at least during the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, but because they wanted additional assistance to be able to do so. And of course, we know that as these negotiations move on, states' emissions have increased quite substantially, as have the environmental impacts. So implementation of Kyoto, this is where we start to see diplomacy falling apart. Between 1997 and 2005, states start ratifying Kyoto. The United States, under a change of administration, walks away in March of 2001. Everyone thought Kyoto was dead if the world's largest emitter wasn't involved. The only way through which they could get Kyoto to actually come into effect was the diplomatic work that the European Union did with Russia. And Russia negotiated a deal in order to be sponsored to enter the WTO. And as a result of that deal, Russia ratifies in 2004. Russia at that stage having 16% of greenhouse gas emissions. So Kyoto enters into force on the 16th of February in 2005. So already, we're getting well away from 1992. And it comes into force when 61.6% of Annex 1 greenhouse gas emitters are signatories to the protocol. And it now has 193 states that are members of the Kyoto Protocol. The United States was the only large Annex 1 emitter not to ratify Kyoto after Australia ratified in December of 2007. And I just want to show you this, these very clear graphs that you can see. This is from the IPCC fourth report in 2007, which shows that significant uptick of the main greenhouse gases of carbon dioxide concentration, nitrous oxide and methane, where you're bubbling along at the year 1000 through to the 1800s, then you hit the Industrial Revolution and you see these massive concentrations of CO2 equivalent into the Earth's atmosphere in terms of parts per million. So I'd just like to, it's a very clear graph to show you just what an impact industrialization has had. And so where to get us today? Well, Paris Agreement came after, the Kyoto Protocol had been for 2008 to 2012. Getting states to negotiate a post-2012 agreement fundamentally failed at Copenhagen in 2009. There was absolutely no appetite for states to being willing to commit themselves to any significant target. And the reason why is because we have the massive growth of emissions from the BRICS, but specifically from China. So between the United States and China, the two largest greenhouse gas emitters. And this tension between this norm of common but differentiated responsibility and the historic emissions of developed countries was offset by a very real recognition that developing countries, particularly middle income or higher states, were having a huge impact on the actual emissions of what we now call the global carbon budget. And so that failure in Copenhagen meant that by 2015, Paris could not fail. There had to be an agreement. And this agreement had to be different from what Kyoto had been and what the EU had been pushing for at Copenhagen, which is hard targets. The EU went out on a huge push to sort of make 1.5 degrees a normative target that everyone could agree upon. So the EU climate diplomacy was to really make 1.5 the rallying cry. And I think that has actually worked. The European Union aimed for a 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 and engaged in a high degree of sort of climate diplomacy with the High Ambition Coalition, which is representative of Pacific Island states, Latin American countries, some African states that are really concerned with reducing climate change within a sort of 1.5 guardrail to avoid catastrophic climate change. So it was more of a non-binding agreement than a hard law, and it really reinforced this idea of nationally determined commitments. Determined commitments was new at Paris, and the overall focus here was for states to bring what they could to a global agreement. And this is perhaps where people are both in favor of Paris, but also recognizing that it is incredibly weak, because what it does is ask states to bring what they are capable of to the international agreement to provide their nationally determined commitments about what is the best for them, and then try and calculate whether or not that is enough globally to get us to 1.5. So obviously there's some very real expectations on large emitters to make deep cuts, but it's also not predicated on any state having to be bound by any specific cuts. And this, of course, raises some very, very real problems, and we're seeing this today. So at Paris, states agreed to, what their targets would be in relation to 2005. In Australia, that was between 26 and 28% reductions to 2005 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the sort of means through which this Paris Agreement could work is that because there were no hard targets to be held accountable for, what states agreed to, and this is relatively unique, although is starting to be used a little bit more in international organizations, is a pledge and review system. And you see this in the human rights system. You see this now in being possibly adopted in the Convention on Biological Diversity. The pledge and review system is this idea that states will review each other's nationally determined commitments, and whether or not they are capable of meeting them. And so in some senses, this is an uncomfortable situation that states generally don't like to be in, because, for example, in the Human Rights Council, scholars have identified that states are unwilling to criticize other states, right? So we know this makes sense, because not only do you not want to offend another state with whom you either have friendly relations or ambivalent relations, you don't want to exacerbate tensions with states you're already having difficulties with. The pledge and review system therefore opens states up to a whole basket of diplomatic concerns. But in the absence of being able to measure against a hard target, this is what states have agreed to. And scholars that have looked into the accountability structures of the Paris Agreement argue that it is possible for a sort of independent review to be undertaken by a committee to determine whether or not states have met their commitments. But it is the system that is in place. And this is why COP26 is so important. It's important because states are meant to come 5 years after Paris, plus 1 year extra because of the pandemic, to demonstrate what they have done since Paris. And so states have been asked not only to have new and their most ambitious nationally determined commitments, but also to be reviewed as to whether or not they are on track. And I think one of the biggest problems with this is, of course, that climate change is increasingly being felt. And states really don't have much of a margin now. One of the biggest concerns is obviously whether or not states are willing to bring their most ambitious targets to Paris. Because of this relatively weak structure of accountability, it raises questions as to whether or not this can even work. And I think there has been rightfully a degree of skepticism about how international environmental commitments can actually contribute to addressing environmental problems. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because the IPCC reported in 2001 that we are already in a 1.3 warming world. Cumulative emissions are going up. Every single ton of CO2 equivalent into the atmosphere matters. And so the pledge and review system is raising very real questions as to whether or not states can be held to account for nationally determined commitments. We know that 2019 had a global average temperature of 1.1 degrees above estimated pre-industrial levels, which contributed vastly to enhanced ice melts, sea level rises, heat waves, droughts, unprecedented large-scale wildfires of record intensity. The IPCC has highlighted that member states' nationally determined commitments are on track to realise a warming of between 2.9 and 3.4 degrees of warming. And this, as the United Nations has identified, their disaster reductions office has identified, will lead to a future hydrometeorological hazard intensities that, and I quote, surpass known experience and which alter loss and damage equations and fragility curves of almost all human and natural systems. Now, that's frightening. It's frightening because over 113 states have provided new or updated nationally determined commitments, which the UNFCCC Secretariat will decrease greenhouse gas emissions by only 16% in 2030, by 2030, when a cut of 45% is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees. So current nationally determined commitments have us on track for a warming of between 2.7 degrees by the end of the century or higher. Every single metric ton of CO2 matters for our carbon budget. The Paris Agreement COPs are the closest thing we have for holding states to account for their NDCs and for collectively reining in greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen an incredible movement of the High Ambition Coalition, principally driven by the host for the COP, the United Kingdom, by the EU and the United States. We've seen commitments by China to reducing to net zero by 2060 and to reducing funding for fossil fuels outside of China. But we also have massive pushback. And the massive pushback speaks to like-minded developing states and other laggards like Australia that continue to do as little as possible, or indeed continue to approve the expansion and extraction of fossil fuels. And one of the biggest concerns is whether or not there will be any shift in the reduction of fossil fuel production. And we are not seeing any evidence that nationally determined commitments are in any way reconciled to the ongoing production of fossil fuels that would be in any way commensurate with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. In addition to which, the COVID-19 global pandemic, while a short blip of reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, also demonstrated that states were willing to spend stimulus packages on continuing production of fossil fuels. The subsidies of fossil fuels continues, in other words, unabated. So we've seen the potential or ongoing production of 190% of more fossil fuels by 2040 than is consistent with the 1.5 degree aim of the Paris Agreement. So while states are rapidly and very, very quickly seeking to identify what their nationally determined commitments will be, there is a very real concern that what goes on at Glasgow might not be sufficient for what we need to do within this decade in order for us to avoid catastrophic climate change. And I think I'll stop there and open up to questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Park. It's now over to our question coordinator, Alex, to moderate our question.
Fantastic. Before I begin, I remind everyone that you can submit questions through the Q&A box at any time throughout this question session. We'll keep checking them throughout, so please don't feel shy, ask away. Our first question is, if the US was not a member of the COP, is it likely that China would would more actively pursue a path of leadership in environmental issues because it's more able to control the agenda than other international bodies where there's US participation?
A really good question. It's kind of interesting. China has never been a leader on international environmental issues. It tends to be sometimes a laggard, but it's never at the forefront. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, you know, in the grand scheme of things, China is a relatively recent developer. Also, capacity is a significant problem. A lot of the environmental issues do need a great deal of technical assistance. But towards the end now that we're seeing China playing a much more active leadership role in international affairs, it's a question of how to do so. And so China and India have, as I mentioned, really been advocating for greater resources and capacity in order to address environmental problems. Whether or not China could actually take the lead here without the US, I just, to be honest, can't see that happening. I think China can make some ambitious cuts. I think those, and that might be more my lack of imagination, but it very absolutely really does put development at the forefront of its aims. And I've read some of its 5-year plans working towards making them sustainable. But it is a very real tension for China to shut down, you know, fossil fuel industries. So, you know, everything China does will have an impact, whether or not it is at the forefront of global negotiations. That's just a fact. Whether or not and how it could lead is another question. The history of global environmental agreements identifies that the US has been the strongest advocate for environmental change. And when it leads, the world still follows. Whether or not China can do that is another question.
I guess just following on for that, keeping with the China theme, do you think China should commit to net zero by 2050 instead of 2060 as is its current goal?
I think looking at what it can achieve by 2030 is the real question. 2050 is too late, 2060 is too late. So, you know, it has to be what it's doing right here and now. I haven't looked specifically at what their interim targets are to make meaningful cuts by 2030. It is making very ambitious statements. Being able to achieve that, of course, is where the rubber hits the road.
Hey, our next question, taking a bit of a different tack, just feeling a bit more domestic. How do you deal with fossil fuel money in politics?
Ooh. Oh, as in the Australian government?
Australia, but I suppose internationally as well, if you want to broaden it out to other countries.
Yeah, so I think vested interest is one of the biggest reasons why we've had inaction for decades. New York Times investigative journalists identified that some of the biggest fossil fuel companies had known from the 1960s onwards through their scientific testing the impact that fossil fuels were having. But that is not the message that those companies were giving publicly. So the release of that information was significantly damning for fossil fuel companies. We know that there has been a very strong relationship between fossil fuel companies and governments and disinformation campaigns that have continued to cast or shed doubt, leading to the whole climate denialism, climate skepticism that's just been going on for decades. So there is, that has stymied effective responses from government. And I think it's particularly glaring in Australia. I'm not an Australian politics scholar, but the academic literature is pretty clear on the two major parties being sort of responsive to the mining industry. So I think that the key concern is obviously how to shift that debate. And I think that the debate has significantly tilted where we are now at the point of experiencing the impacts of climate change. And so the biggest shift has been from, and hopefully will continue to be, moving from what are the costs of transitioning, what will it cost us to move away from fossil fuels, to what will it cost us not to do so in terms of arable land, in terms of fresh water, in terms of sea level rise, extreme weather events, which we are now seeing and have seen over the last 2 years.
Great. And our next question asks, what sources of emissions are actually included in the nation's emissions account? Is it a problem that states fail to include their militaries in those counts?
That's a really good question. I haven't looked into this, but the military, particularly US military, has a substantial environmental impact in terms of CO2 or CO2 equivalent emissions. I'm not entirely sure exactly what we have counted and who, what each state's contributions entail. So I think that it has been quite open to how states want to determine what they include, but I'd have to go back and check.
I guess just turning to Glasgow for a minute. I guess one of the big features in the lead up to Paris was the fact that, as you mentioned in your talk, there was a huge amount of climate diplomacy that went on in the lead up to that. And there was a really, really big effort to mobilize different countries. How do you think the preparatory work has gone for Glasgow? Do you think countries have pushed it into a situation where there can be a kind of ambitious outcome from the summit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues to it. I think there has been quite a significant amount of work done by the High Ambition Coalition. I think China and the US coming out with strong statements, the UK coming out with strong targets, the EU being a very consistent advocate for targets. I think we can see a ratcheting up. This is, I guess, one of the benefits of having a global environmental agreement. Even if we don't get what we need, we're still getting something. And so some skeptics are concerned that, you know, we're just going to go, states will go to Glasgow and they'll just announce what we already know. I think there is room for a ratcheting up and more ambitious targets and commitments. But I think it really also comes down to what they are agreeing to do. And I'm hoping that we will see from from Glasgow, an emissions trading system, a truly global one, that really changed the shape of emissions trading as we currently know it. This was something that was started under Kyoto, and it was, always intended from that point on that we would have markets to be able to try and regulate emissions. And there have been various attempts all over the world to do that and to implement that. And we had one here from 2011, which was later scrapped. That this becomes something that the world commits to. That's one thing that we can get out of this. The second one would be greater commitment towards climate financing through the Green Climate Fund for developing countries, which states, particularly industrialized states, have been sort of underwhelming in terms of funding.
I guess coming off from that with the nationally determined commitments, I guess one of the things that's often been said about them is that they're, as you kind of sketched out in the talk, there is the tension between it's what the states are willing to do compared, though will they agree to the alternative, which is probably a top-down approach with an international agreement that binds them. Are the nationally determined commitments here to stay? Are we essentially locked into that formula from here on out?
I think we are. It's kind of a broader appetite or no appetite for being held to account for international commitments, which, really started, in the 2000s, where states just didn't want to be held to account for more international commitments, particularly when they were struggling to meet the ones that they had already agreed to. Combined with the fact that, the developed versus developing fissure had grown so large that there was no way of repairing it and no way of the United States agreeing to be bound by targets when China wasn't, very much feeds into a sort of broader acceptance that there has to be other ways of doing business. And so the nationally determined commitments is a very face-saving on behalf of states, that they can all have, the best that they can bring to the table, even if it's not their best, which is where the sort of lobbying comes in, not just from civil society, but also from business that want clear rules of the road to be able to make planning for their own industries, and how to manage that transition.
Fantastic. Our next question reads, it feels like here in Australia that gains in renewable uptake and emissions reductions are the result of external economic factors rather than policies and regulation by government. How much is energy economics and the price of renewables being driven by government policy in Europe, the US, and China? And how much is government regulation and international commitments having a direct impact on emissions reductions?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's both. I think they're very hard to disentangle. Certainly, the growth of renewables is driven by the expectation that states have to do something. And so that has this self-fulfilling prophecy effect, right? Markets cannot be disassociated from governments. And so we've seen decades of renewables work, but it's really only in the past a few years where the actual price of renewables is now cheaper than fossil fuels. And of course, we have to take into account the fact that fossil fuels have been heavily subsidized for decades. And there's only been real research being done, or not being done, but made visible by international organizations, by the OECD, by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, to document how states have been propping up fossil fuel industries for so long. And so renewables have an incredible challenge ahead of them because they have a very different cost structure, and they have to compete with renewables. But they're also at the same time, as they're becoming, as they are now, cost competitive, they're seeing a removal of their subsidies. So while fossil fuels are still being subsidized, renewables are having that taken away. So this is creating a real problem for future investment, even though we know that, as I said, the International Energy Agency said we need 40% of energy globally to come from renewables by 2040 in order to meet the 1.5.
So our next question is, how do we make climate change action more bipartisan? In countries like the US, and I suppose to some extent in Australia, there's been significant polarization on the issue. How do you bring the two sides together?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm not sure if I've got any answers. The United States is particularly toxic, and I would put Australia in that same category. In other countries, it's not polarized. The United Kingdom made it very clear under Prime Minister Blair to make the Conservative force or argument for renewables and for addressing climate change. How you move back from that is incredibly difficult. And I think obviously the overwhelming interest of, at least in Australia, of people wanting action on climate change is what's going to change that discussion. Australia, as we know, has one of the highest take-up rates of rooftops solar in the world. So it's the average Australian that wants action on climate change. It's the sort of foot dragging, if you like, from government that is really the problem. And now we've got, we've got the banking industry, we've got the insurance industry, and we've got the Australian Business Association all coming in favour of market solutions to climate change. So I think that is turning. How it turns in the US is anybody's guess. I mean, I think that's a very broken system, and it's much more than climate change, but climate change is obviously suffering because of it.
Great. Our next question, taking it in a bit of a different direction. Why can't states be taken to international courts by their citizens or by other states for their failure to act on climate change?
Great question. We don't have a mechanism for it. Obviously, citizens can take their governments to court within their own domestic systems, and we are seeing that with young people taking the Australian government to court over the impact of climate change on their future. It's definitely the case in the Netherlands. That's happened as well. There has been an argument for the crime of ecocide to be put on the International Criminal Court. I don't see states having any appetite whatsoever for being willing to be held to account for destroying the planet. Despite the fact that there is increasing work that has been done to document the impact, the precise impact of states' activities to climate change. So that work is being done, that forensic work being able to document the causality between actions and impacts in climate is going on. But I see no willingness on behalf of states to be to opening themselves up to that.
Fantastic. Our next question is, would you be able to speak more about the role of Japan and the European Union and how the varying kind of coalitions, leaders and laggards within the international system interact on policy issues to achieve climate change advocacy?
That's a great question. So Japan has, in international environmental agreements, often played what might be called a swing state and a veto role. So Japan is not a leader on international environmental commitments, but it can have and come out with quite ambitious targets. And we saw this with Kyoto. So it moved from being in the same camp with the United States, where it sits on many issues, to actually coming out in favour of having stringent emissions targets. So Japan can play that swing vote, going from a laggard to a leader. And of course, it takes a very technologically focused role in terms of how it seeks to do so. So, I think this comes through quite a lot when talking about Japan. So how are you going to meet your targets? And the answer is, we will find a way. And so that's sort of an ambition backed by a sort of belief in the power of increasing energy efficiency, increasing, technological innovation to be able to meet those targets. The European Union has consistently been an advocate for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is also consistently across a sort of whole host of multilateral environmental agreements advocated for the environment. It's not self-interested, right? So it does advocate the best way for it to be able to do so. And so the types of policies that the European Union does is offset by the fact that it is a union and it can do some internal horse trading in order for sort of internal subsidisation within the EU to take place in order to meet its international agreements.
I guess following on from that, how do you see Australia's relationship with various states playing out over climate change, particularly the South Pacific? What do you see as its role in that region in relation to climate and environmental agendas?
It's a difficult one because on the one hand, Australia has no plan to stop emitting fossil fuels. It has a gas-led recovery from COVID. It has within 1 month approved 3 coal mines. So these are not nothing. And the Pacific is watching, and they know full well the impact that this will have for them. At the same time, Australia has a Pacific step up where they're injecting, over $1 billion into the region in order to help them develop, including some really progressive policies in relation to climate change. So it's a very uncomfortable position, I think, Australia is in to have its cake and want to eat it as well. So, it's very, very clear the statements coming from Pacific leaders, like from Frank Bainimarama from Fiji, who said, you have to stop. You cannot keep doing this. You need to have targets that you can meet. We are suffering and we continue to suffer. The king tides and the extreme weather events are going to keep battering those islands. And we are a close neighbour and we will be dealing with the consequences of it.
I guess following on from that, more generally, how do you negotiate with the few countries that benefit from climate change? For example, Russia, which stands to gain great benefit from resource extraction in the Arctic.
Well, you outcircle them. You have to build in incentive structures that make it more difficult. Yes, certain states will gain more from the changing climate. But there are ways, as we know, politics and markets are social constructs. We can shape these, we can design markets, and look where we're starting. The EU is already starting to do that, that sort of putting on tariffs for imports from fossil fuel emitting states. These are the types of incentive structures that can be built into future markets and future agreements.
I guess coming back to another thing that you mentioned earlier in the talk, you talked about the High Ambition Coalition and the way that they worked. And the High Ambition Coalition was obviously a huge factor in Paris, and probably one that hasn't been talked about as much as it maybe should have. Firstly, could you just explain briefly for those watching who the High Ambition Coalition were and what they did? And secondly, kind of what have they been doing since Paris?
So it's basically the European Union, it was Norway, it was states from the Pacific Islands, it was a few from Africa and Latin America, and it was essentially engaging in climate diplomacy to go around and to I don't know, I'm trying to get the right word here, but spread the ratcheting up idea that we could get to 1.5, that all states should be involved, that this is something that states have to do, and that you can be part of it too. And so that sort of climate diplomacy is sort of very intense to sort of gain the momentum from an international agreement. And that's, again, one of the benefits that I guess we're kind of seeing the work of that now, or if you haven't, sorry, my light's going, over the past few weeks and months, really, where states have been commenting on other states' need to improve their commitments and to make their nationally determined commitments ambitious. And so, some people might be very skeptical of international environmental agreements or international agreements in general, but this past week has been a frenzy in Australia. And it's precisely because Australia is now going to COP26.
I guess if we were looking forward at sort of taking a bit of a more optimistic outlook, why should we be optimistic about the future of international environmental agreements to stop climate change? And what are the reasons that we could stay below the 1.5 degree target?
Why should we be optimistic? I'm optimistic because I'm an optimistic person. We could fail. We can absolutely fail here. We are within striking distance of 1.5. And that has been because of the actions of states over the past few years. There is absolutely, we could still be on track for a 2 to 3 warming world. That would not be as catastrophic as over 4. Over 4, it's game over for humanity. But under, 1.5 is ideal. That's where we want to be. 2 is what scientists and now politicians have agreed to. 2 would be the absolute sort of, where it's not great, but that's okay. Over to far more extreme weather events. We are crossing ecological boundaries. We don't even know the precise impacts that that's going to have, and we don't want to anticipate that catastrophe. So look, like I said, I'm optimistic because I'm an optimistic person. I do think we can do it within 10 years, but we absolutely have to give it a go. And so if there's a way for states to build on this momentum and continue to push, and of course, this is backed by the Australian voters, by voters all over the world, by citizens, by school kids. Strike for climate. The momentum is there. Let's keep it going.
Let's finish on that optimistic note. That makes a refreshing change, particularly on this topic. Next week, we'll be putting out our next edition of Columns from Glover Cottages, in which our counsellors and interns recommend articles and readings and broadcasts on matters of international interest. We plan to resume our live events at Glover Cottages as COVID restrictions ease, while still retaining the wider audience by continuing our Zoom broadcasts of events. But now, to finalise proceedings tonight, I'd like to invite one of our interns, Luke Goldman, to move a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Ian. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank Professor Susan Park for her address this evening. Professor Park has recounted the gradual steps in international coordination with regard to climate change, highlighting the often slow nature of diplomacy against the deterioration in climate forecasts. Her account of the IPCC and UNFCCC's long-term role scientifically championing climate change awareness was set against the role of state sovereignty in limited national adherence to international agreements. A number of great questions from our viewers were prompted by this address, and Susan has given some great answers, especially regarding the role of China as neither a leader nor a laggard on climate change, the ambition for a truly global emissions trading system coming out of Glasgow, and the argument for ecocide to be considered an international crime. So thank you, Professor Park, for your contribution to this debate and for your address this evening. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, everyone, and good night.